Welcome to the Safety in Numbers podcast. I'm your hostess, Sheila Hansen. So this is my very first interview for this podcast. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Aimee Piller. Aimee is the owner and director of Piller Child Development, an outpatient pediatric company with 3 clinic locations in the greater Phoenix area. She is a practicing occupational therapist with almost 20 years of experience in a variety of pediatric settings, including outpatient home health and schools. Full disclosure here, Dr. Piller is my niece. She has always been a woman who strives for the truth and the most effective methods to achieve whatever outcome she is aiming for. So, Dr. Piller, my podcast is about just education in general. As you know, I taught middle school for a really long time, and I generally highlight topics that are important just to the classroom teacher. General education usually, and some special education because we get all sorts of students in the regular ed classroom. And I'm interviewing Aimee because she just came out with her new book. You and I, especially during your graduate stuff when you were getting your master's in occupational therapy, we have had many discussions about OT. So could you give a general description of what occupational therapy is for my audience and what an OT does in their practice?
Yeah, so first off, thanks for having me on the podcast today. Occupational therapy is one of what I consider the rehab sciences. So most people will think of physical therapy, speech therapy, and then occupational therapy. The 3 of us work very closely together to help people with their day-to-day needs, anything following an illness or injury, or in the case of kids, we work with a lot of clients with developmental disabilities or have encountered an injury or some sort of diagnosis that might have prevented them from developing in a trajectory that you expect. And so the OT is going to come in and help with things like behavior errors, sensory processing, self-care, and social participation.
When you were getting your master's degree, we were, because I was working at the time and we would have all sorts of conversations as to the overlap of your profession and my profession. That's huge. What led you to occupational therapy? Because you started out in the education field. You have a bachelor's in elementary education.
Yes, I always knew I wanted to work with kids, and so I started off my journey as a elementary education major, and I finished that degree. But during my time as elementary education major, I was in the school setting doing practicums, and just as different happenstance, I saw the OT in the schools and a couple of other summer camps I had worked in, and then lo and behold, in my special education class, I was designated on our mock IEP team as the occupational therapist. So a few things that kind of came together, and I thought, oh, this is actually what I want to do. I loved the working one-on-one with students, and I also had always enjoyed working with kids with special needs. And so it was very much a natural fit for me to make that jump from education to occupational therapy with the goal of working in the school system, which I did for quite a number of years.
So I have read your book, Implementing School-Based Occupational Therapy Services. I would like to share with my audience the benefits of the occupational therapy profession and sensory processing, especially as it pertains to teachers in the regular education classroom and the challenges that those teachers face. So in my years of teaching from 98 until just last year, I didn't see many occupational therapists. In fact, I remember only seeing one in the public school setting. Doesn't mean they weren't there, but I never knew they were there. So in your opinion, why do schools not use OT services more?
Well, that's one reason I wanted to write this book, is to show ourselves as occupational therapists as well as the educational world how much we can offer all students. Because oftentimes the occupational therapist is viewed in the school system in the IEP world, or for students who have special needs, identified special needs. We are actually a related service under the IEP and how IEP classifies us. So we are considered a related service, which means that we might be needed and we might not be needed based on the evaluation process. And oftentimes occupational therapists are designated just into the IEP students who receive services through IEPs, and we often have a high caseloads where we don't have a lot of other time to do other things. And we function very much off that service minutes. As any of you who've worked with an IEP know, there's service minutes. We have to get all those service minutes in. And so a lot of times we're just either pulling a kid or working with one student, and we don't have time to do anything else in the day. And so that, again, was part of the reason I wanted to write this book, is to show how we can balance that a little bit better and provide more supports to teachers and educators for many things our students need, namely sensory processing.
And as you went through your training, I remember thinking about some of the things you were studying and how closely it related to struggles I was having in my own classroom. And so we were identifying, oh, that is a sensory processing need. That was, I remember talking to you for a long time about that. And your book, actually, the subtitle is A Multi-Tiered Approach to Sensory Processing Needs. In simple terms, what is sensory processing? Because there's part of here that reads that there are 8 senses and not 5. I was always taught there's 5 senses.
Yeah, and sensory processing, actually, it refers to our brains taking in all sensory information from our environment. It's a little bit of a hot term right now. I feel like a lot of parents come and say, oh, my kid has sensory processing issues, or my kid has sensory issues. You might hear that as a teacher quite often. Yeah. But sensory processing is actually an integration of all of our sensory systems. So there's the 5 sensory systems that we are well versed with. There's also 2 hidden sensory systems. That's vestibular, which is our movement system, and proprioception, which is our body awareness system. Those 2 systems give us a sense of ourself. They also impact our levels of alertness and arousal. And all together, the brain takes in sensory information constantly from the environment, processes it, determines what to attend to and what not to attend to, and then makes a motor or behavioral response. So that's what sensory processing in general is. It's what drives us as beings, as human beings.
So you take it in and then your brain sorts it and decides what to act on and what not to. So then sensory processing needs are when there is some sort of a disruption in either the processing or the intake of that sensory.
Yeah, sometimes there's a difficulty in maybe responsiveness or reactivity is what we call in sensory processing, meaning I might over-respond to a sensory input. So auditory is a big one, especially in the classroom. You might see certain kids may have trouble. There's clock ticking, and they can't not attend to that clock ticking. That's a hyper responsiveness to auditory. On the other side, we might be hypo responsive to sensory input, meaning we need much more to respond. That's very common. We might see that a lot in kids that have movement or vestibular. They have such an almost insatiable need to move that no matter how many times you tell them to sit quietly in their chair, they're rocking that chair, they're moving in that chair. They just can't keep their body still. So they have a high need for movement.
Yeah. And the issues in a big classroom are you have both types of students in the same room. So one can't stand noise and the other one can't stand not having it. And so dealing with those issues can help classroom performance and behavior. So many teachers are familiar with learning styles such as auditory, visual, kinesthetic. Is sensory processing related to a student's learning style? So for instance, somebody who is an auditory learner, do they have sensory processing needs in other areas or something like that?
Well, sometimes the sensory processing just drives who we are as a person. So It drives our preferences. Each of us have different levels and variety on how we process sensory input, and that really drives us to what we like to do and what we enjoy doing in our life. Some of us, I happen to be pretty in tune to auditory, and that also translates into I'm an auditory learner. So I like to hear things. I don't necessarily want to watch a video about it. But other times with students who are very kinesthetic, they probably are movers, or even us, a lot of times educators, you didn't pick a job that sits behind a computer all day. You probably kind of like to move around a lot, right? So you have a high need for movement. That drove your choice of occupation. So same thing when you think of learning. Yes, sensory processing impacts how a child likes to learn or is a preferred method of learning.
Okay. Because, so I'm very kinesthetic learner. If you tell me about something, I kind of understand it. If I see it, I understand it a little better, but I don't really remember it until I do it. So yes, very much so. Okay, so the next question, do only students with special needs have sensory processing challenges?
Well, we see a lot of students with special needs that also have sensory processing challenges. For example, autism is probably the most commonly diagnosis we think of with sensory processing because it's part of the diagnostic criteria that a child has sensory processing differences or difficulties as part of the diagnostic criteria for autism on the medical side of things. So we see that a lot. But also each of us, like I just spoke of, have different levels of sensory processing, differences. And when those differences impact how we choose to or can participate in our daily tasks, they become challenges and can really impact what we do. And that's when we might need a little extra intervention or extra support. So I see many clients in the clinic who would not be identified as a formal diagnosis or even receiving special services at school, but still have a lot of sensory processing needs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I remember when you were in your training, or even just talking to you otherwise, I would describe a challenge a student is having. You're like, oh, I wonder if they might have this sensory input need. So you and I have talked about how OT can be a benefit to people with like things like PTSD and other challenges connected with anxiety. And anxiety is a very prevalent issue in today's classroom, especially since 2020. Can OT be used to help anxiety in the classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. OT really actually got our start in the mental health world. We started in psychology, and that's so all of our roots are about helping people feel better in their own bodies, and therefore they can participate in the day. And that initially started with way back in the early 1900s, individuals with psychosis and anxiety and other mental health disorders. So that carries over even today. And from a sensory processing standpoint, we know that the way we process sensory input impacts our levels of alertness, our arousal levels, and can cause our bodies to feel uncertain in the world, which then can become or look like anxiety. So anxiety is something that also we'll work on from other standpoints. I have another, actually a school-based curriculum that's the Teen Anxiety Program for children ages 12 up into their up through high school. That's lots of interventions that can help general ed students learn to manage anxiety so that it doesn't become debilitating. They understand how that anxiety can be used in positive ways versus it becoming out of control and debilitating. So yes. OT does play a big role in managing those symptoms.
That's wonderful. That's awesome. Yeah, I am going to link your teen anxiety program in the description here, so anybody that's interested can take a look at that. What are some sensory processing challenges that a regular ed teacher might see in their classroom that they didn't realize were a sensory processing issue?
Probably the most common one that you might not think of as sensory processing is those students who just cannot sit down.
Yeah.
No matter how many times that you tell them, and it seemed like, and that's important to differentiate. It's not that they don't want to do what you're asking them to do. Their body really can't do it. When a child has a sensory processing need that impact to that extent, it's like, I'm so hungry, I have to eat. It's the only thing I can think of. I have to eat right now. And their body is telling them, I have to move. Like, I know she doesn't want me to move. The teacher told me not to move, but I have to move. And so it becomes this aspect of, it can appear to be the child being defiant or going against. They never listens to what I always does the opposite of what I tell them to do, when really it's just the sensory need that's driving that.
I see, yeah. So now getting into a few bits of your book. Let me see, page 9. Yeah, there's a lovely chart on page 9 that says categories of special education with incidence level, and it's put out by the Department of Education. I have had several of these categories of students in my regular ed classroom. Most of them did not receive occupational therapy services. So can a OT have significant impact on things like hearing impaired, obviously autism, we talked about that, and developmental delay is another obvious one, but also specific learning disabilities, speech and language impairment, and other health impairments, which is where ADD and ADHD are categorized.
Yes, and these are the special education categories of eligibility. That's what the chart is referring to. And so, yeah, anytime a student has any difficulties that might impact, and specifically in the school setting for occupational therapy, motor, behavioral, sensory, or social participation, or just independence in for some of our kids that have some more significant needs in their daily living activities, that's where the OT can intervene. So that's part of the evaluation process for the IEP, is that the OT should be intricately involved in that process to evaluate those areas of motor and sensory social participation, things like that. to determine the need for services. Okay. Oftentimes, though, depending upon access to the OT or access to resources in a district, that might be something that is not always evaluated, although it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and when I read those, I was surprised at how many of them were actually on that list that OT could have an impact on, because there's so many of those that I had in my classroom. And even I noticed now there's one that's emotional disturbance. I did work with some emotionally disturbed students at times that had not been diagnosed with anything. So our current SPED programs, and this is kind of a hot button topic for a lot of people, many, and I can't really say many, but the special education programs that I'm familiar with through my teacher friends and through my own experiences, many times, not entirely, but many times were more about modifications and workarounds than achieving an actual goal on their IEP. So does your approach focus on achieving a level of improvement so as to not need occupational therapy services or intervention anymore?
Yes, actually everything presented in the book, it really functions under that aspect of working towards goals and some sort of goal achievement, whatever that or attainment, whatever that may be for the student or the population or the group. And so the interventions, and I think OTs just are really trained to work towards that aspect of what's the client's goal. Maybe it is to sit and attend in a classroom and complete their math assignment. And so that's the end goal. So I'm working towards that. Sometimes there are modifications that are going to help the client get there, the child get there, but there's also direct interventions or direct supports you can also provide, but with the end goal of I can participate in math class as I'm asked to do with the rest of the students and as my teacher expects.
So your book is about implementing an MTSS approach to intervention, which is a multi-tiered
system of support.
I couldn't remember the S's. So what is MTSS and how does it work?
So MTSS actually comes from the federal government. The federal government mandates that schools provide interventions through an MTSS lens. And the intent of MTSS is to provide supports for students at the least amount of intervention and to the most amount of intervention. So early supports are intended to help students achieve better or be more supported so that then more significant supports aren't needed. So tier 1 is the population level. So that in the book, and this is actually, to me, was an information I learned that it can look different by state, because apparently in my state, which I come from, Arizona, population level, it refers to classroom or school or district. Any of those would be considered a population. Apparently the state of California has a completely different way that they classify that under MTSS. So something to be considered about when you're looking at your own state and district. But the tier 1 population, that's most of the students will benefit from an intervention. So these are really just supports that are provided. You might think of, it might be a certain type of curriculum that's put into place. Social emotional curriculums are very commonly implemented at a tier 1.
Yeah, through the counseling system usually.
That's a pretty common, I think, view of that. And then MTSS, or tier level 2, is for students who have identified some levels of need. And so more specific intervention is targeted towards those group. An example might be a pull-out reading group. These students are at risk of falling behind grade level for reading. So we have 5 students that go out and work with someone to try to help them give different supports and more targeted support, so that then they don't move to the tier 3, or they have enough support to get back to grade level, so that we don't need, before we go to that referral to special education, which is tier 3. Tier 3 is special education.
Okay, so like a full-on
specially designed instruction. So for the way the MTSS program is set up to work is that everything should be already implemented with things in your general population. Then you have identified through universal screenings, and the book talks about how the OT can be involved in the universal screening process when oftentimes we're not. But if we're involved in some of those universal screening processes, we can help identify students who might have sensory processing needs at that moment, provide some interventions, and then hopefully they may not become a child who's not able to participate in class.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what the idea is, that if we provide earlier supports and more targeted, then they may not need specialized instruction after all.
That would be good, because then that would relieve some of the pressure on your special education system, which in all the schools I've ever worked at had a very high special education population. So we had teachers that were strained in everything that they had to do.
Yeah, and I think probably most educators today would say you have quite a few number of students on an IEP in your classroom, right? There's a lot of times it's like,
or 504s.
Yes. Yeah. And so we're starting to see that lots of students do have unique needs. Is there a way that maybe we can provide some different types of interventions earlier or in a different way, so that, I mean, if I have a quarter of my classroom, general ed classroom, on an IEP, maybe we can do something a little bit different from a systems approach to help that not get to that point.
So your book is all about the school setting. What prior experience, we've already talked about how you have a bachelor's in elementary ed. What prior experience do you have with OT in a school setting?
So I started off in working in a school system, in a school setting, and this was years ago, before MTSS was a thing. That law had not passed yet. But
when did that law pass?
I want to say 2015 maybe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's about 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was about 2015, the revision that kind of dictates MTSS.
Okay.
And so my first job was in a school, and I didn't know that I was doing this MTSS model. I came in, it was a very traditional approach. These are your students, you pull them out, you give them OT, and you bring them back to the classroom. And I just was like, I really would like to get in the classroom. So I asked this to some teachers if I could get in the classroom and work with the students in the classroom and take them out. And then I found a teacher that was open to that. And so I started with that teacher. And then I went in and she was like, can you just run an OT group in here? I was like, sure, let's just run a group on that. And then it just became, she started talking to the other teachers about how effective it was. And so that spiraled out that actually I started doing this approach that I write about in the book on my own without even knowing that this was a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 approach.
Oh, how fascinating. So you almost invented it yourself. That's my family. Is your approach only for students with special need, or is there benefit to regular ed? Well, I think we've already talked about that quite a bit. So with your tier 1, that would probably be the most that a regular ed student would see you. Or would there be any regular eds also in tier 2?
Well, sometimes your regular eds are in tier 2. The tier 2s are the students. So in the book, it provides some examples of what you're doing at a classroom level for sensory processing, and there's a certain specific part on how to do that from the OT side of things. But then you might have some students in your class that are like, these students are always having a really hard time right after lunch. There's 4 students, they seem to set each other off. OT comes in, determines they have sensory needs that would be really beneficial, pulls these guys out, 4 students, gives them sensory group, and then they go back to the classroom. That's an example of a tier 2.
And they don't need to have an IEP to do that.
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
Correct.
No IEPs, no 504s or anything. That's wonderful. So in your tier 1 description, all students are included. Are all students formally evaluated, or how do you know what the need for an entire population might be?
This is a big thing, especially in the OT world, because we get kind of stuck in that tier 3 model and mindset that like, and we all know that you can't, in tier 3, if that's the IEP process, thing with an evaluation, like a timeline starts, you have to get parent permission, like there's all kinds of things that happen from a legal standpoint. So OT's like, I can't assess a student without parent permission. Well, let's take a step back. You can't formally do an evaluation, but aren't you assessing your students every day when you're in the classroom with them?
Yeah, by observation.
What they need are observations, interviews. I have lots of little games in there designed for the OT to actually assess the sensory processing of a population level. What is the needs of this classroom? A lot of it is observation, interviews, evaluation of routines. When do students need sensory input? Are there particular students that need certain types versus another? Can you design the classroom in a way that can meet those needs?
What is an example of a tier 1 need of a population that you would intervene with OT?
Yeah, so I think certain times of day. So let's say that you're going from cafeteria to recess, and then in time we come back in and it's time to do math. Well, many times your students might be pretty excited because you just got out of recess, and movement gets us excited. We also play. We should be at a higher level of alertness when we're playing, but when it's time to come and sit and do math, and maybe that's the only time I can get that built in, let's do a calming activity. Let's turn the lights down. Let's do a deep pressure meditation session or deep pressure tactile activity, and then we go and sit and do our math.
What would be a deep pressure tactile activity?
Well, we
talk very technical.
Sometimes would be so deep pressure is a very calming input, and we would maybe do something for an element. I know you're in middle school, but elementary we might have like let's close our eyes, we turn the lights down, we're going to get ready to go to the beach, we're going to think about the beach, let's put our sunscreen on. So when you do your sunscreen, you have to push really hard as you're pushing down your arms, and then you have to put it on maybe if your friend next to you wouldn't mind, could you put it on their back for them? But remember, you have to push very hard.
Yes.
Something like that would be a deep pressure fun activity for kids.
That's interesting. I would never have thought of that. So what is the role of the OT themselves in the MTSS? And it seems like you would need a whole army of OTs to implement this. When I first read the book, I'm like, well, would you need like 50 OTs to do this? Because if you're observing an entire population and then, bringing it down to the tier 3, what's the role of the actual OT in this?
And again, this is like a big reason I wrote the book, is because a lot of times OTs go, but I'm so busy. I have too many kids on my caseload already. I don't have time to even do anything other than barely get these minutes in, all these minutes, right? Because the OT is coming at it thinking, I have to get my IEP minutes in. That's how we function. So that's how we're paid. And that's what we're supposed to do. That's our legal requirements, to get those minutes in. And so it does seem like, well, how am I going to have time to do these other things? Well, if I'm providing intervention support, the MTSS level 1 and 2, I'm more of just the guidance person. I'm going to train the staff on how to do things. I'm going to partner with other individuals in the MTSS team or special education team. When you're doing universal screenings, can you check off these things for me and then I can take a look at that list and see if I need to go look closer or if I can develop a program based on what you saw. So it's about using a team approach as well. Even at a tier 2, I can design a sensory group for the students. I can give it to a paraprofessional perhaps, or someone else who's in charge of some of these tier 2 level interventions, like the reading group specialist, and train them on how to do those, embed a 10-minute activity into the session, and then just have very good ways of gathering data, which there's a whole chapter on progress monitoring in the book, how to do that effectively, so you can quickly look at that data and make changes if needed.
Yeah, and that would be big, being able to observe the data of what's going on. Mm-hmm. So basically you're saying that the OT would be more of an advisor for tier 1 and tier 2, or a trainer for tier 1 and tier 2, and then the OT themselves would do the tier 3 interventions.
Yes, and the goal twofold in that is, one, if I have so many, as OTs, we know we have a lot of referrals for behavioral, which oftentimes are sensory. So it's like, but I don't necessarily need to service them all directly. Maybe I don't need to service them all directly. What if I can provide these supports at a tier 1 and tier 2? Now I do have more time for those kids on a tier 3 who really need more direct intervention and more increased support. That's what that tier 3 is for. And now I actually have the time to do it. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we find, and I don't know if this is common in the regular education classroom, but when I'm ready to discharge a client from OT or a child from their IEP, you don't need us anymore. That's really the goal, right? Mm-hmm. Parents have a hard time with that, and I can understand, because all of a sudden you've got all these supports to nothing. Yeah. And so by having the MTSS in place, you're not dropping to nothing. You're almost just dropping to a tier 2. You still have support, so it's not so scary for the student, and it's setting the child up for success too.
Yeah, and I just thought of something. In this process, could there also be a puzzle piece that the parent would take? Like, could there be training programs for parents?
Absolutely. Parents can be trained in any of these techniques. I mean, specifically designed for the teacher, but oftentimes that might go home. Look, we're doing these in the school setting, and the OT's always working with the parents as well, so there can be translated across environments.
That's wonderful. So, on page 35, this was an interesting one, because this one I really related to. I don't know if it's prominent in the elementary level, but in the middle school level is pretty relatable, is that you describe kids who wear the same 1 or 2 outfits or shirts or jackets all the time, and I ran into this a lot with my students. You'd have students who wore the exact same clothes all week long, even if they smelled bad, or if they had gotten a stain on it, or anything. They wore that same outfit all the time. Are you saying that is, or could be, a sensory issue, and how so? And how could working with an OT help?
Well, it could be. I mean, an evaluation would tell you, but a lot of times kids or adults even that have significant tactile sensitivity, so my tactile system would be over responding, and meaning that I can not tolerate touch, different fabrics, things on my, since I brought it to my cognitive attention, I was like, my hair is brushing my neck. That's okay. My brain says, I'll ignore that. I don't need to swipe that away right now. Someone who had tactile sensitivities would only be able to attend to that hair on their neck until they swiped it away. So sometimes it's like that with clothing. I only can tolerate this type of clothing because it's what makes me feel okay. My body feels okay in this shirt. That other shirt's too itchy. It makes me feel funny. And so it becomes that aspect of, I'm only wearing this shirt because I know I feel okay in this shirt. Sometimes it's not tactily related, but a lot of times it is.
Yeah. So in those situations, would that be more of a tier 2 or a tier 3? I guess it depends on the cause as to whether it would be tier 2 or tier 3.
Yes.
Oh yeah, and on page 39 you describe hyperreactivity and hyporeactivity. And from what I read, the hyporeactive students seem very similar to the ADHD students, or students who are diagnosed with ADHD. So is ADHD a sensory issue?
Sometimes. Many kids with ADHD also have sensory processing differences. It's actually quite commonly seen together. And this has been even more so in the last probably decade, where I think a lot of students will seek out OT services because they have a diagnosis of ADHD. When I first started in OT, it wasn't as much as it is now. And some of that is that interventions have just been better, but also spreading the word that sometimes ADHD is related to sensory processing. Like if I'm like, they're hyporeactive and I have a high need for movement and a high need for touching things, or maybe I touch everybody around me, or I have a high need for visual, so I always am looking around and looking at different things, or distracted by these things, then that's all my brain's trying to do is get more sensory stimuli. I don't even know what that person up there was talking about. I couldn't even attend to them because my brain is so focused on getting this sensory input that whatever the teacher up there just said, it's gone. I don't even know what it is.
So, and you described it earlier as like if you were so hungry you couldn't concentrate, that's what it feels like to the student who has a sensory processing need.
It's an innate physiological need, sensory processing. We can override it to a point with cognition, just like if you were hungry, to a point you could be like, I'm going to be eating soon, like it's okay, I can get through this. And then there's a point where you're like, nope.
Yeah.
I need to get something in my tummy right now.
Yeah. And
same thing with the kid, or they can, a lot of times, so you might see that it appears to fluctuate. Well, they did fine last hour, or they did fine in this class, so they can cognitively kind of keep themselves together, and then there's a point where they can't.
Yeah. I've seen that a lot. Does medication for ADHD affect their sensory processing?
Well, any medication can have side effects that do impact sensory processing, especially when I'm thinking of vestibular processing. Sometimes you'll even see on the list of side effects that causes vertigo or may cause dizziness.
So is vertigo a vestibular thing?
Yeah, that's a vestibular issue. So that's impacting vestibular. The important thing to think about with kids with ADHD is that we're giving them stimulants for their attention, right? That's to help them become more attentive.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. You got a kid with ADHD, they need to be drinking a Monster drink.
Yeah. Yes. But I will also say that kids that have poor attention, sometimes it might be a sensory processing issue. We know that, I talked about the tactile difficulties. If your skin is a very large sensory organ, you take in a lot of information through your sensory system. If you are hyperreactive to tactile, meaning that sometimes even the wind blowing across your skin is disruptive to you. That's how sensitive some of these kids are. Do you think you're going to be able to attend to anything else in your environment if you're going into alert when the wind blows across your skin?
Yeah, no.
Okay, so then no, you're going to look like a kid who might be diagnosed with ADHD. But if you then give that child a stimulant and he's already overstimulated, so it can be really important to note those things and to make sure that's being considered.
To know for sure what's going on in the child's situation. So hyperreactive students sound like students with anxiety disorders, a constant state of high alert. So these kids are these kids the ones that are just a ball of anxiety? And could some anxiety disorders be helped by OT? We've already hit on that some. But are these kids just like
a lot of times sensory processing, if I'm hyperreactive, and auditory is one that gets overlooked often because kids with auditory hyperreactivity, it's hard to tell. Like they're hearing things that you and I are not hearing. And then you're constantly having to try to ignore that sound and pay attention to the teacher who's talking. But then also think about a situation when maybe an alarm was going off and you couldn't shut it off, and you're like, at some point you're like, okay, can someone just shut that off, please? Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden your threshold for auditory has been reached, and you're like, I need to get this shut off now, or I need to move environments, one of the two. And maybe you can't, but your stress level is up here then, right? You're not as easily, you can't, I think about the mall at Christmas time, it's busy, it's noisy, you go home and someone's like talking to you, like, I can't talk to you right now. So that's how our kids feel. They're always like up here all the time. I'm trying to figure out what's going to be harmful to me, what's not harmful. And that can really cause, now I distrust my environment because I don't know what's going to hurt me or not hurt me from a sensory processing standpoint. So I get very anxious and very controlled on I will control my environment because if I control it, I know it's safe.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then that would be the part of the OT would teach them how to take control of their environment or their response to the environment.
Yes,
because you can't always control an environment.
You're going to work on that sensory processing to not over respond. That's OT can help that so that we don't need, so that we're not over responding to sensory input, or we are not having that high need for input either. We can help that sensory processing system do better.
Okay, and not notice everything.
And that's really
involved.
more from like that tier 3 level, what the OT would be doing.
Because you need to work directly with the kid. Yeah, and you did write a curriculum called the Teen Anxiety Program. I do have a link in the description if you're curious for that. Tell us a little bit about that program.
Yeah, so that program really was designed for youth, adolescents and youth, 12 up to 18, from a general education perspective. So it's a social emotional curriculum, but what is unique about it compared to other social emotional curriculums is that, one, it takes into account that the sensory processing piece, which many curriculums don't acknowledge that piece at all. Another sensory system called interoception, which is just understanding my internal body cues. And how to actually register what a trigger is for anxiety and what to do about that.
Say that word again?
Interoception.
So it's an I.
Yeah, interoception.
Okay.
Like, that's what their internal body senses, like that feeling of back to hunger. That knowing you're hungry, that's your interoception told you because my stomach felt a certain way. I know that means I'm hungry. Some kids don't have a mismatch between what that feeling is and what it means.
Okay.
And so that's something that can cause them. If every time you feel hungry, but you're not sure what that means, you're going to act a certain way, usually not in your best behavior, but you might not know you just needed a snack.
So your teen anxiety program helps them to pay attention to that part of their system.
To understand that and what a trigger for anxiety might be. So if I start to listen to my body a little better, I can notice these things coming and then use my toolkit to get an intervention.
Yeah.
And the other piece is too, it's very student driven. It functions under a program called Lifestyle Redesign, which focuses on developing healthy routines and habits that are long lasting, and it's very evidence based. So it's not that we do it in the moment. The techniques that it uses are designed so that the person embeds them within their life for the long term, which is probably the most unique aspect.
Yeah, I was going to say, probably a lot of adults could benefit from looking through that curriculum.
We did just pilot it in the graduate school setting, and it did very well for 20 to or
That's
22
a very
to 25
high anxiety
year olds.
environment there. Yeah. Graduate school,
just finished that study, so be on the lookout for that
Okay.
publication hopefully soon.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. So page 56, you state that performance skills are in the domain of the OT, motor, processing, and social skills. So in the regular classroom, a performance skill is one that improves your performance or your memory or your organization or your handwriting or completion of assignments or how well you do on a test. So OT can actually improve how a student does on a test?
Yeah, yes. And performance skills for the OT is something that's pulled out of our practice framework, which defines what we do. So performance skills are just, if you saw the list of them, you'd be like, wow, this is everything. And that's because everything impacts something, right?
Yeah.
Improving it. So what would the OT do for performance skills with improving a test? Well, what do I need to take a test? I need posture to sit at the desk. I need grasp to hold the pencil or use the computer or I need some fine motor to take the test, whether it's paper, pencil, or computer. I have to have eye-hand coordination. I have to be able to see things. And then I have to also be able to attend and focus and filter sensory information. I have to make decisions. And so all of those things, all those performance skills OTs can work on. And
I was going to say, you break it down like that, you can totally see how you could absolutely improve things.
Yes. And OTs are experts at that task analysis, which is some other things discussed in the book to help teachers get those tier 1 and tier 2 interventions in their classroom.
Yeah. Schools, I have found in my career, are often resistant to change, especially when you have a new wave of something popular coming. So your approach requires changing the environment to fit the student. That would be a complete change in philosophy for a lot of schools. So a change from scheduling students based on where you can find a spot for them to actually focusing on the needs of the student and where they need to be placed, perhaps like time of day for their math class. The master schedule is always a sticky subject. You don't go near the counseling center when she's working on schedules. It's always a touchy subject, and to improve it would require hiring more teachers usually. So, would implementing your plan necessarily require an overhaul of an entire system?
Well, not an overhaul completely, but maybe a change in viewpoint. So I do talk about, and there's a chapter in there on transformational and lasting changes in systems, because the school system is a big system.
It's a huge system. It's got systems within systems.
Yes. And again, the OT is kind of just this one little person that even you said you barely even knew existed. Yeah. So for her to come in and make a big lasting change like that is probably not going to happen, but also not the intent of the book. I mean, I mentioned in there, is there one teacher you can start with? If there's one teacher that's open to you coming in, they're going to see changes, and then they're going to start talking about it in the workroom. Mm-hmm. So that's how I would approach some of those systems. Some systems are more open to change. Some are more rigid on that. If I knew that this scheduling was not something in this system I should touch, where can I look at and find something that I can? Oh, well, we can change the physical environment maybe, or we got a budget for we've got budget for funds to add in some changes to our classrooms. Well, maybe that's a place the OT can embed themselves. So as I am thinking about how to facilitate lasting change, I'm always trying to find the door that's already half open. I'm not, because that's the place to get started. Then you start to gather the data. The data is going to be positive and show the change. And now other people, even administrators, are going to say, what's going on over there? Yeah. That school's not getting behavioral referrals like this school is. Mm-hmm. What are they doing differently? Here's our data. Now you've got an ear that they're going to listen.
Right. Because if you go into any place and bust down the door and say, I've got a great idea, they're going to be immediately skeptical. And
everybody has a great idea, right?
Yeah. And that brings me to my next question. Are there any pilot schools for this? Do you have some pilot schools that you're working with, or you know?
Say that there's a pilot. OTs do this throughout. I actually have a good friend of mine who works at the UCLA lab school, and she does this on a daily basis.
Oh, okay.
And obviously, you could say, well, it's a private school, and I get that. And that's oftentimes, yes, they are more open to things like this, but she does it very well. And so they're out there and talking to those people. She presents on it. She helps, we consulted a lot for the book just to say this is feasible, right? Yeah, this is feasible. She actually utilizes her tier 3 students to help run her tier 2 groups.
Oh, neat.
So it's really nice integration of regular ed students, special ed students. So some good problem solving. So that's a good school that they have.
I like that idea. I want to work for that school. Okay, so one of the reasons for resistance is a need for proof of concept and cost, which you've talked about. You do have some proof of concept there, but also the training of the staff in order to change how they see their philosophies, because many of us have our own philosophy of education and ways of doing things, and to integrate new things is really challenging. So I would often go back to what I knew worked because what I was trying wasn't working. The few school improvement methods and programs that stuck with me were ones that had like ongoing support, workshops that you could go to, things like Love and Logic. And there was another one, I can't remember the name of it, but it's Writing for Understanding or something like that, that had continual workshops and little workbooks that they would send you. How would you support the faculty and the staff in this approach?
Well, that's the beauty of why I kind of presented it under an MTSS model, because most schools already have some level of MTSS progress monitoring, support for staff. And if the OT can come in with the sensory piece as well, then that's already embedded within a system that's hopefully working, or at least people are open to trying.
Yeah.
So that tier 1, and part of the tier 1 intervention itself is staff training. So staff training happens, they implement in their classroom, you get the data back. If the data's going to show you, do I need more training? If so, then talk to your person. Can I be at the next PD day? Can I do a session at the next PD day? OTs can do that, or the teachers can come say, hey, can we have OT do our PD day? Because sometimes the OT doesn't know they can do that, and teachers are like, I got a lot of sensory kids in my room, can the OT come and do a PD day?
Oh, that would be a great idea, yeah.
So the training is ongoing, and that's the beauty about MTSS is, which sometimes could probably be a headache of all the progress monitoring, but I do present a very easy way to monitor progress in the book that is not burdensome, but very gives clear. Us the data that we need to continue the intervention or change the intervention. And so that's what's nice about it, because once you start to see, it's self-reinforcing. When you start to implement the right sensory interventions in the classroom or to the right students, they're doing better, they're happier, there's less behaviors, the teachers are happier. So it becomes self-reinforcing, which is really the nice part of, that's what you want.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I like that a teacher can come to the OT and say, hey, I'm seeing these behaviors, and get immediate feedback right there. So yeah, that would be great. So what would an administrator look for to begin to implement this approach aside from reading your book? You know, can all OTs do sensory integration work and build this tier system, or is it more of a specialty in your profession?
There's definitely an advanced certification in sensory integration, but all OTs are trained in sensory integration and sensory processing as entry-level therapists. So we're all able to do it in an entry-level way. You can become more advanced. I have 3 certifications in sensory integration and processing, but you also are trained as an entry-level therapist to do that. And so, I think from that standpoint of administrators connecting with OTs, I had told you a story earlier about how I talked to the MTSS director at the very large district in Southern California, and I had went to one of her sessions on MTSS implementation, and it was just how to promote change amongst your schools and everything kind of we're talking about. And I said, just wanted to tell you how great your presentation was. I'm an OT, and I'm always trying to talk to the occupational therapist about how we can provide sensory supports at tier 1 and tier 2, and we can really get in there and help out with these things. And she looked at me, very large district. Southern California also is pretty known, they like OTs there a lot, and goes, I never considered having OT as part of MTSS. And I thought, wow, they don't even know do that. So OT's going to come to them, but also talk to your administrators and say, hey, OT can help in MTSS. Yeah. Did you know that? Plant the seed so it can grow.
And this thought just occurred to me. So a lot of smaller districts actually contract out their therapy programs. So that would kind of put a limiting factor on it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, there's a bit of a barrier to that aspect when the OT's a contract personnel. However, I do talk a little bit in the book about workload and caseload and how you can still utilize more of a workload approach for contract therapists, if that's the case, and how to present that to administrators, because maybe it's a little different approach, but still is doable. So
yeah, absolutely.
Another challenge, but
there's always challenges. Life would be boring without challenges. So can regular education teachers integrate some sensory activities into their classroom without an OT to guide them?
So this is another important point I want to drive home, is that anybody can can pull sensory activities off the internet and do sensory activities. We do them all day in our lives. You're already doing them as teachers. You're putting them into your classroom. But what is different is that everyone has different sensory processing needs. And only OTs are trained to identify those needs and how they impact participation. So the OT knows that if one student needs...
All right, so a few technical difficulties later in that my camera battery got too hot. So can you continue with what you were saying?
Yeah, so anyone can really take a look at Google or ChatGPT and get a list of sensory interventions, right? That's great. Anyone can do that. But only the OT understands how sensory processing, how to evaluate sensory processing in populations, groups, and individuals, and how that sensory processing impacts participation. A common example I see of where the wrong intervention might be provided is trampolines are common sensory interventions, what they say. Everyone, the kid just let him go jump on the trampoline. He needs some movement. So they let the kid go jump on the trampoline, but vertical movement's actually alerting. So it makes, if you're jumping, you're going to alert. And most of the time they're trying to get the kid to calm down because we need to get into the classroom. So if you're like, jumping is a great movement activity and it provides proprioception, which is what you find on Google. So like, let's have the kids do jumping jacks. Well, that's going to hype them up. And if you're trying to calm down to sit down at the table, that's the wrong intervention. So only the OT is going to know that. So it's going to be able to provide the sensory interventions that will actually be effective for your students and actually make a change versus just blanketing sensory activities.
So it's not just generic, you can do any sensory activity and get the behavior you desire.
Correct.
Yeah. That's. I remember you sent me a book about movement in the classroom. I remember that being part of them.
Yep.
All right, so do you have anything else you want to share about teachers and the OT and the MTSS approach?
Well, in the book, there's lots of examples and lists of sensory activities and when to provide them and how to work with the OT and how the OT can work with the administrators. So lots of practical strategies on how to implement this program. But at the end of the day, I think the end goal is that our students are able to be in the classroom more and participate and learn. That's why they're at school. And so by providing sensory supports, which we get that hot sensory processing, my kid has sensory issues, this kid has sensory issues, you can give lots of targeted supports in the classroom that take just only a couple minutes out of the day and have much better results for yourself as a teacher and for your students.
There was one thing in that, and that I wish I knew where that little book was. I think I see it on the shelf. It had to do with pressing your arms together like that. Yeah. My shoulder's injured, so I can't do it. But as a way of waking up and moving side to side and up to down. And so I taught that to the students during our state testing. Like if you're falling asleep, you get yourself some muscle stuff. And I would see kids doing it all the time. Great. Like, ooh.
Such an easy strategy. Yeah. You taught it to them a couple of times and then they do it on their own.
Yes, right.
Perfect.
All right, so you recently had this really exciting article come out, and I want to add that to the end of our interview here. I know it's getting kind of long, but for one, you're the lead on it, and that just makes me super proud. And it's about sensory-based interventions again. What stood out to me as a classroom teacher is that there are two sensory processing needs that are mentioned, autism and ADHD. In your results, you listed that alternative seating did not improve attention in your research, and I just want to say thank you, because it had never worked for me in my classroom. In fact, oftentimes when I would have the kid in an alternative seating, whether it was on a ball or a T-stool or sitting up on a stool at a standing desk, most of the time the novelty of the new seating place was what drew their attention. So they still weren't attending to what they needed to attend to. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this was a systematic review of sensory-based interventions, which are mostly what you're doing in the classroom. And the research showed that providing alternative seating, which as an OT, we often recommend for, the kid needs movement, give this ball to him in the classroom to sit on and he'll attend better. Actually, did not help attention at all. Doesn't mean it's not an intervention that can be used, but if your goal is to improve attention, nothing's really backing that's improving attention or on-task behavior. So that's important. I mean, it's going to be a shift for us as OTs, but also just to know that it's good that you're seeing that if the teachers are seeing as well, that's not helping. So
yeah, that, and I'm going to try to find the part where it was talking about fidget spinners. But I remember when that came out, and so kids would come in, I have ADHD, so I get to have this fidget spinner, and they would have it on their desk and do this all the time. So they were attending, but they were attending to the fidget spinner and not to what they were supposed to be attending.
Yeah, and that particular article, there was one article about fidget spinners that, and it actually showed that the students, and it was a school-based one, and the students had, quote, more violations of attention as a result of using this fidget spinner than those that did not use it.
However, they have these little sensory cubes that you can hold in your hand.
Yes.
Those I noticed actually had more, they worked way better.
So you'll see that there's a different types of the fidget spinners, giving them some tactile input, but squishies are often deep pressure tactile input, which showed very good results on increasing. So different type. Again, you can see the difference.
Yes.
They're both fidgets, but only the OT really is trained to know the difference.
Which one the kid needs. Yeah. Then there was this part here that there is a strong strength of evidence for deep pressure tactile input positively impacting functional outcomes. And it talks about weighted vest did not significantly improve in certain situations, but did in other situations. So again, that's an OT kind of a thing. So not as a classroom teacher, this kid's moving a lot, he needs a weighted vest. So that's not something you want to do. Bias using movement on a treadmill with vibration showed statistically significant results for quality of life, attention, and executive functioning. So does this have, like in this article, I realize you just reviewed articles of other people's research. Is this something that would incorporate into a classroom by putting a treadmill in a classroom?
Well, not necessarily a treadmill. Treadmill is a way to do it, but they're just walking, right? So that was the intent of it. And this kind of section of the study was, what was significant about it was that there are multiple sensory supports provided, not just one sensory system. So in that, it had tactile, vestibular, and proprioception in the intervention, which showed good impact, versus maybe if I only did vestibular, it wasn't as positive impact as addressing multiple sensory systems. Again, speaks to the importance of, yes, a sensory intervention may target one sensory system, but research is showing we need to target more than one.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And there's a lot of the stuff, and I can't find it here because I didn't highlight it, but that as classroom teachers, we were told to do in the classroom, but in this, it talks more about the caregiver or the home person doing it at home and having results in a classroom.
Yeah, so this was something that we found because we looked for also teachers in the review and not just caregivers in the home, but we didn't find any studies on teachers' effectiveness. So hopefully by this book getting out, OTs starting to utilize these, teachers starting to use the strategies, we can have some evidence on if it's impacting classroom participation on
This was another part that I found interesting, is the deep tactile pressure. So is that like just deep massage, like you were talking about pressing really hard on your skin? Decreasing sympathetic arousal and increasing parasympathetic arousal. So it's a calming thing, like you were talking about coming in from outside. You don't jump on a trampoline, but you do this
deep
sort of
pressure
thing.
tactile is always calming. So that's something that you can put in your toolbox of, like, this is always calming. Weighted items, that's why they're often used.
Is that a
pressing together? Yeah.
Okay. So that was one that was found. So what was interesting in this article is a lot of the things that are prominent these days were found to have no evidence of their effectiveness. And that some other things like the deep pressure and was there anything else in there that was found to be more useful that is not used as much?
Well, I think not necessarily, but the caregiver training was very, very high evidence. And I think we can all make a pretty safe...
So a teacher is considered a caregiver?
Yeah, I think we can make a safe assumption. We need to get the research on it that's going to carry over if we're training teachers in the same way that we're training caregivers.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Well, is there anything else that you would like to tell us about your book or your article or your teen program?
No, I think it just, sensory can be a big key to success in your classroom. And so if you work with your OT really closely and you have someone who understands how to assess what your students' needs are and give you the right input and really just as establish a relationship, you're going to see really good results.
Yes, and I agree. Thank you very much for coming on my podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. I am so proud of you. You are like my favorite OT.
Boom.
Boom. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in class.